Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is 3 lessons learned on my personal writer journey. Today's going to be a solo episode. I had a few listeners reach out and ask if I'd be willing to share a bit of my own background. They seem to enjoy some of the personal updates and personal background that I give. Now, the intro to this podcast talks about my years in the industry as a bookseller and industry rep, and I do share some of my writing updates, but I've never really shared some details from my own writer journey. So I thought I'd take this opportunity in episode 20 to share a little bit about my own writer path, my own writer journey, and along the way insert a few of the lessons that I learned during that journey. But first, let's do a bit of a pre-episode personal update. My next book with Dundurn Publishing, one that's co-authored with Shana Krishnasamy, called Macabre Montreal, has been doing a bit of back and forth with our editor Dominic these past few weeks. Now, just a couple days ago, I flipped back the latest in the round of edits. It's started off as a great book, and it's getting better with each of these rounds. Dominic and Shana and I are really enjoying this process. This was also the part of the editing process where Shana and I decided on the placement of the images. Now, the final, we do have final say, but the layout folks will do the exact final placement. This is where we recommend the different images go. And we have about 25 pictures for the ghost story book. One of the great things is Shana and her husband had actually gone out with a camera and had taken several of the shots. So that was great, and that made life so much easier because we didn't have to go and get permission. We had permission because Shana owns the copyright on them. Yay, that's exciting. But we had to also decide the captions that were going to go under each of these images. So that was always an interesting part of the process. It's even more interesting in probably 3 or 4 weeks when we actually get to see, a PDF of the first cut of the layout, where we get to go and do another sort of line edit / proofread at that point. Also, interestingly, in that process, we had to make a decision to not include a couple of chapters that included modern day serial killer stories. Even though these stories did happen in or specifically relate to Montreal. Now, I'm a little bit disappointed, and I was the holdout for wanting to include them in the macabre element of Macabre Montreal, but I really think that the editor's vision of how these two darker tales actually turned the book from a fun book of ghost stories and some historic macabre events, it turns it into something truly dark, and I see his point, and he wanted to keep it more on the lighter side, so I went with saying, okay, let's let those 2 chapters go. Reality has a way of really turning things darker, I suppose, but I also look at the work that I put into that as, well, maybe I'll end up just using those somewhere else, like when an interviewer asks, are there any pieces of research or chapters you wrote that didn't end up in the book? And I go, well, let me tell you. And obviously, depending on the audience, if it's an adult audience that can take the graphic nature of some of these serial killers, then I'll go into it. If not, who knows where that's going to be useful in the future. So now I'm also in the throes of editing and writing the interstitial pieces, so the introductions and about the authors, for a WMG published anthology in the Fiction River series. This one, I believe, is going to be coming out in December or January, and it's called Feel the Love. And these are stories that I selected from really amazing authors, and all the stories center on love and different aspects of love. Yes, there will be some romance in it, but the theme isn't romance, the theme is love. And there's many great stories here that I have in the anthology that focus on different aspects of love, like, parental love, or the love that, you have with a pet, friendship love, and even more intriguing explorations of the concepts or elements of love, like, seen from the Greek, for example, like Greek legends and things like that. It's really, really awesome. And I need to get that back to Allison, the publisher there at WMG, for June 1st, so that Christine Catherine Rush, who does the final line edits on it, can do that final line edit. In terms of other personal updates, since Liz and I completed the 21K half marathon challenge at the end of April, we decided to continue to work at being fit together. We're going to the gym as a couple and working together on the same routine. Now, this is a really fun way to relax together after a work day and before dinner. We're working in the gym together on a weightlifting routine. Nothing too aggressive. It's more about toning and getting into better overall bodily shape than it is us coming out looking like Mr. and Mrs. Universe. And it's funny, I say this is after work. Yes, I work mostly at home now, but it's still a work day, and I still get up at usually 5:30 a.m. every morning. I spend the early a.m. writing, mostly creative writing, and then later in the morning I reserve for editing or other non-creative writing or other writing-related activities or some of the industry consulting work that I do, etc., but I still consider it a work day. Now, it's interesting because I do most of that work by myself or through virtual calls. Now, having a place to go outside the house, the home office, which I adore, and God, I love the commute way better than going into Toronto used to be, because it's only, a 2-minute commute to the coffee machine and then another 2-minute back upstairs to the den. But having a place to go outside the house is useful, particularly for my mental health. When I was working in an office, there was the water cooler or the coffee machine. But working alone at home, having a specifically timed place to be and activity to do in a more social way is useful for that balance. Now, I like how both of these things lead to a more balanced, healthy writer life, which I think is important. Just a reminder that in an early episode, I think it was episode 2 of the podcast, I spoke with Joanna Penn about her new book on that topic and about the importance of the balance in the mental and physical well-being, particularly for those of us whose main passion is a mostly sedentary lifestyle behind a keyboard. Now, I'm going to get back to this gym experience as one of the lessons learned just in a bit during the main part of this podcast. But for now, do you hear that? Oh, I hear it. It's time for the terrible tongue twister, twisting by the fool segment of the show. Twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the fool, twisting by the fool, twisting by the fool. Such a fool. Today's tongue twister, sponsored by Findaway Voices, is one suggested by a listener who would rather I didn't mention their name. So, for the sake of anonymity, I want to protect the innocent. I'll just call you Aloysius. Sound good? Thanks, Aloysius. Now, Aloysius wanted me to pick from one of 2 really popular, well-known tongue twisters. One of them had the word pick in it. So I thought, well, if I'm picking, I'm going to pick the pick one, right? Because, again, that's almost a tongue twister in and of itself. They also asked if I could do this one in the voice of Brian's mom from the Monty Python movie Life of Brian, because they enjoyed that so much from a previous episode. Maybe it's because I swore in Brian's mother's voice and they enjoyed that aspect of it. Who knows? In any case, here goes, and thank you, Aloysius. Okay. I've got to get into Brian's mother's voice. All right, Brian's mother's voice. Here we go. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peckers. How many pickled peppers did Peter Piper pick? Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. How many pickled peppers did Peter Piper pick? Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Oh, pecker. Oh, I guess swearing in Brian's mom's voice is just a little bit more fun. Well, that was this episode's tongue twister. Thanks for reaching out and asking, Aloysius. If you have one that you specifically want to hear, or if you want to suggest a voice for me to do the tongue twister in, just hit me up with an email, mark@markleslie.ca, or ping me on Twitter @markleslie, and I will do my best to oblige because I'm just a people pleaser. That's what I am. I'm not a picker of pickled peppers. I'm a people pleaser. I do love my alliteration. Now, this was a tongue twister sponsored by Findaway Voices. If you want to pick an amazing platform to work with, Findaway Voices is where you can either upload your audio file if you already have the rights to it or if you already produced it yourself, or you can pick a pickled professional to work with on that. Now, I just did this week, and again, a bit of a personal update, is a 10,000 word short story called A Murder of Scarecrows, which I love. And I have Eric Brian Moore. I just got the audio back from Eric, and I approved that just yesterday, which would have been Wednesday, because it's Thursday when I'm recording this. And I'm really excited about that, and I've approved it. I've paid for that, and it is going out there, and yet it'll be yet another audio product that I have available, thanks to the good people at Findaway Voices who made this tongue twister thing possible. Now, Findaway Voices is a corporate sponsorship that helps pay for the hosting fees for the Stark Reflections podcast. But it doesn't pay for my time and energy in producing the show. Now, that comes from my Patreon supporters. I'd like to give a shout out to a new patron of the show this week. Thank you to Perstina K. Houghton. Hope I pronounced that right. I do appreciate your support and the support of my previous patrons, because your support shows that you enjoy and get value out of this podcast. And I really hope that you enjoy the bonus content available for patrons. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. You can also thank me by either becoming a patron supporter at patreon.com/starkreflections, or by leaving me a review on iTunes or the podcaster of your choice, or blogging about it, etc. I mean, a great review last week from Georgia Rose is still keeping my ego inflated and my giant head soaring in the clouds. Thanks, Georgia. That review and the Twitter love that you shared for this podcast is awesome and also so greatly appreciated. Now, today's episode, as I said, is going to be about lessons learned on my personal author journey. I'd been planning on starting in sequential order, but my personal update talking about the gym led me to thinking about something that I really wanted to share. I learned something in the past few weeks based on my regular new gym routine with Liz. So let's get to Lesson 1, being open to changing your perception. Liz and I started going to a local Good Life fitness gym because A, I don't really do running outside in the cold all too well, and B, we had a absolutely terrible, never-ending winter/late starting spring, combined with C, a broken basement treadmill. So what's a boy and girl to do? I'd never been a fan of the gym. Why? Well, because it took me back to being that 90-pound weakling. Perhaps you remember him from the back of comic books. If you're my age, I turned 49 this past weekend. Or if you're younger, then perhaps you've heard about the Charles Atlas comic strip on the back of comic books. I'd always felt like the 90-pound weakling getting sand kicked in my face, because I was more into books than being a sportsy, athletic person. So going into a gym and being surrounded by jocks with giant muscles on muscles always pushed me back to the mindset when I was 12 or 13. And I would get beat up running home from Cub Scouts by a few larger muscle-bound bullies who'd chase after me in my Cub Scout uniform. Yeah, I was begging to be beat up, wasn't I? It's all true, though. There I am, Cub Scout uniform, bullies coming after me, punching, kicking, mocking me, the whole bit. Well, I'd never been all that athletic. Man, could I ever hoof it and run fast. And several times I actually made it home before they caught me. So at least they helped me in that regard, which came in handy later as a runner, although I don't sprint all that fast except when someone scary is chasing me. But the gym always made me uncomfortable, and it brought me right back to that gigantic lack of confidence, that scared kid running from the big guys. And I thought that the gym experience would be the same exercise in personal humility. Now, me not being able to bench press as much as the handsome guy with the washboard abs and arms twice the size of my legs. Of course, moving from the main treadmill area of the gym and over to the side where the main weightlifting space and the serious players were, i.e. the big muscled men and women, initially made me really queasy. I did not want to do it. I thought that all those muscle-bound guys would be muscle-headed too. Big, giant dummies who'd laugh and point at the weakling girly man. I could see Hans and Franz laughing not so quietly as my rubbery arms failed to get to the 10th rep of an arm curl. But I did my best to be open to the experience and to seeing what might happen. I told Liz I didn't feel good about it, but I'm going to give it a try. And I was surprised. Yes, there might be a few of those perfect specimens of the Adonis-style men, and there are a heck of a lot of men and women who are in tip-top perfect shape with arms, legs, shoulders, stomachs that are enviable. But pretty much everyone there is friendly, supportive, good-humored, and welcoming. It's interesting. We sometimes believe things based on either a first or early experience with something. And then we end up limiting ourselves. We end up limiting our later experiences and our willingness to try to do things. We let a single bad experience control the way we see something. So we can't see it for what it is. We see it for what we fear or what we didn't like about that first attempt. Now, I've been listening to a book by Dan Clark. He's a speaker I recently saw in person. And one of the lessons in his book, The Art of Significance, that he speaks about is being open to a viewpoint or experience that you feel strongly about, being open to the opposing viewpoint, and forcing yourself to read up, listen, or learn more about the opposing viewpoint so you could understand both that other perspective, but also better understand your own internal bias about that topic. I recently watched a few arguments from the Flat Earth Society. Yeah, I think of them as laughable, non-scientific beliefs. They're just raging in that element. But there are also some relatively solid ones, given my limited understanding of science, of course. And it was intriguing to me to stop scoffing and laughing at them and to actually watch a full explanation with an open mind. I was trying to figure out how the logic and reasoning makes sense to someone else when it didn't make sense to me. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm convinced of their version of reality or of science, but I found it useful to examine the evidence they were presenting and listen open-mindedly to what they were saying. Yes, I did understand how their interpretation could be different than the one I know to be true based on all the other scientific fact that I have at my disposal and have chosen to also pay attention and listen to. But I walked away with a better understanding of someone with that belief system. I could understand it a bit better because instead of laughing and scoffing, I listened. I didn't change my perspective, but I have a better understanding of where my perspective comes from in relation to their perspective. And I still found that a valuable experience because I did try to look at everything with as open a mind as possible. And I love taking that approach because, again, we're all humans. We all have belief systems, and there are going to be differences in the things that we believe to be true. And I like being able to examine the things I believe compared to what someone else believes and potentially re-examine them. So the same thing comes true with my gym experience. Except in the gym experience, my open mind and being willing to experience and see something again opened my eyes to my own prejudice. I had classified gym people in a certain way. I let my own confirmation bias continue to filter out and let me see anything and everything I witnessed to be filtered through this pre-existing belief that I had that they were dumb and vain jocks. But by going in with open eyes and actually experiencing it again all these years later, I saw that, there were vain people. Yes, there were some people whose only reading might be simple things like men or women on the change room doors. But that much of this was my ill-informed prejudice and the filter I applied. I only looked at the evidence that proved my hypothesis that they were all vain jocks. I'd let that rule me. I let that keep me out of the gym because there were far more friendly, open, welcome, and intelligent people there when I opened my eyes and looked around. And I'd failed to see them before because I only saw the few vain people that altered my perception of what a gym was. So lesson 1 today is about perception and about being open-minded. Now I'm going to tie this back to something from writing and publishing that I think is pertinent. I've been a bookseller for more than 25 years. I have long held the belief that self-publishing was for people who weren't good enough to get published. Hell, even though I had self-published in 2004, 10 years before it was acceptable by the mainstream, or most of the mainstream, or at least some of the mainstream, I subscribed to that commonly held belief. I changed my belief on that, obviously. I've been the director of self-publishing at a digital ebook company, so obviously I changed my perception on it. But my initial perception was that self-publishing sucked, and those who did it sucked. And I will talk later about my own experience in 2004. Now, I'd also had evidence of that because over the years, as a bookseller, the majority of the authors with self-published books who approached me with their non-edited and hastily or poorly designed books that they wanted me to carry their titles, I had to bite my tongue and tell them, well, nobody with any sense of taste is ever going to buy this. I didn't say that. I never did say that. Of course, being a writer myself, I was kind and supportive, but I did want to let them know that most books in stock, even from big publishers, didn't sell and got returned, just so that they wouldn't be crushed when they returned 3 months later to see that nobody had bought their poorly put together book. I never said no to them. I never mocked them. I never made fun of them. But inside, I thought, wow, this sucks, and they have no concept of professionalism, etc. I did want to help them, but that experience over the years, repeated experience, with 9 out of every 10 authors that approached me that was a self-published title, they weren't professional, they weren't edited, and they were likely books that weren't good enough to be published by a real, and I use quotes when I say that, publisher. I did have years of evidence to support that, and if you asked me about self-publishing, I would tell you one of the many stories of those really crappy books that confirmed my bias about self-publishing. But then along comes Terry Follis, a Canadian author who was a graduate of McMaster, and I was working at the McMaster University bookstore back then. So this is back in 2007, 2008. Terry had left me, I was the book operations manager there, he'd left me a voicemail asking if I'd carry his new book. Then he sent me an email, and oh my God, it was like, oh God, it's the self-published author who won't give up. So my initial impression is like, oh God, oh, he's a graduate, I better be nice to him, I better get back to him. So I went and looked up his book. It was a humorous political novel. Oh, I hate politics, especially Canadian politics. Nothing in my mind could be more boring than watching golf. But a satirical novel about Canadian politics might just trump that. Now, I saw Terry had self-published the book and had also released a podcast of himself reading it. So because I'd been an audiobook and podcast listener all those years ago, I thought, well, I'll give the prologue to the book a listen before I get back to him. See how good this book is. Well, what do you know? I listened to it from the walk to the car. It was a long enough walk. It was like a 15-minute walk across campus, and I listened to that prologue. By the time I got to the car, I not only laughed, but I loved it, and I reflected on how this writing reminded me of the best of the early John Irving titles, the ones that had that wry humor in it. It reminded me of some of my favorite humorous Robertson Davies stories. And Robertson Davies, for those of you who don't know, is another beloved classic Canadian author. So I called Terry the next day, and I insisted that we do a big book signing at the bookstore to get the word out about his awesome novel that I thought everyone should read, because I then read the whole thing and loved it. Now, I had to order it non-returnable because it was a print-on-demand title from one of those scary vanity press places. Yeah, the ones you shouldn't give your money to. But I didn't care. I ordered in 40 copies. I insisted that this awesome novel, if it didn't sell out during the book launch event, would be one that I would hand sell myself. So we did the event. Terry sold a few copies, and I had a small signed stack that I knew I would hand sell. And then, maybe it was something like less than 6 or 9 months later, Terry won the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor for this novel. Now, the Stephen Leacock Medal is a prestigious Canadian literary award. It's maybe one of the top dozen Canadian literary awards that exists. And Terry won the award, then he landed an agent, and then a publishing deal with McClellan and Stewart, which is now an imprint of Penguin Random House, one of the world's largest publishers. Then Terry went on to be selected by CBC Canada Reads, that novel, as the best book of the past 10 years. Then it was made into a TV miniseries. Terry has written another 6 novels. The next novel due out soon. I've read them all, and I love each one. And Terry is a well-respected, best-selling, and much sought-after author and speaker. Interesting how Terry helped me see things in a new way after years of prejudice against self-published books. But just a few years ago, Terry admitted something to me that he had not shared before. It was winning the Stephen Leacock Medal that pushed him into the Canadian superstardom. And one of the reasons he had entered the contest was, A, they hadn't said self-published titles couldn't be submitted to the Stephen Leacock Medal Award. B, he had 5 copies of the book left and just sitting around, and you needed to send 5 copies to the judges in order to read the submissions. And C, because I had been so enthusiastic as a bookseller about how good the novel was, and I'd made such a big deal about him and the book launch, and I made him feel like a VIP at my bookstore. He ended up having that extra touch of confidence to want to go ahead and give it a shot and send those books anyway. He never dreamed he'd win. Of course not. Terry has always been modest about his amazing talent. But since I played a tiny role in that part of his journey, I made Terry promise he'd never forget about me on his continued rise as a lauded Canadian superstar writer. So far, he has held true to that and still takes my phone calls. In fact, actually thinking about that, I should actually have Terry on this podcast because he was a pioneer in that self-publishing journey. See, I was nice to him once. I'm going to use the guilt factor to get him to join me on this podcast and support me and also my listeners. What if I hadn't been as open-minded about checking out Terry's books? There's still a stigma for self-published titles. Yes, it's better than even back in 2008, but the stigma is still there. Imagine how many authors were held back from pursuing their dreams because of that stigma or that belief. When it comes to you and to your writing, what long-held perception or long-held belief do you have that's holding you back? That might be something to reflect on. Maybe it's okay to give that something a try. Do you tell yourself that you can't do something just because you tried once and it didn't work out so well? Like me? That 90-pound weakling? Well, now I'm a 49-year-old 210-pound weakling, but I'm open to a new experience and open to enjoying the health benefits of being at the gym and doing this fun activity with Liz. Because I was open to giving it another shot and being open-minded about that experience. Okay, so let's move over to the next lesson or two. And this is going to go back to the earliest days of my writing. Back to sequential order. Think of this like one of those interesting novels or movies where you see something from the relatively recent or present day. You get a sense of where the character ended up, and then you go and do the flashback to that character's life story. So yeah, maybe I'm a little bit like Forrest Gump here, aren't I? But don't worry, I won't explain how life is like a box of chocolates. Anyone who knows me knows I'd be more likely to compare life to a case of beer, or a visit to a craft brewery, or something along those lines, or maybe even a Monty Python movie. But I'll stop reaching for something that works. Just sit here on the virtual bench beside me, and let me bend your ear about the young Mark in the beginning of his writer journey. Don't worry, this will lead to lesson 2 and lesson 3. I promise. I had always wanted to be a writer. I'd always been in love with storytelling. Okay, I'll admit there were times in my youth when I wanted to be a firefighter like the guys in the TV show Emergency, Or I wanted to be a policeman, like the guys from the old TV show Chips or Starsky and Hutch. Say, did I mention that Liz bumped into Eric Estrada from Chips at the Chicago airport back in February or March sometime? Now, he was pretty awesome. He posed for a selfie with her, and she got to tell him that she had a poster of him on her bedroom wall when she was a teenager. That experience was pretty cool, but I digress because I mentioned Chips and I thought of that. But I had wanted to be a police officer like the guys in Chips, or like Starsky and Hutch, the TV show, or in the height of Lee Majors playing on TV's The Fall Guy, I really wanted to be a stuntman. But my long-term ongoing love that I kept returning to was my love for storytelling and my love for writing. It started off when I was really small, and I had these little Fisher-Price finger puppets. It was cool when my mom enacted these little stories with them, but even cooler when I used them to come up with my own stories. And as I got older, I got the more sophisticated Fisher-Price figures. These are the ones, with the arms and legs and props and everything. I even had a stunt van that also came with a motorcycle, a canoe, and a parachute with 2 stuntmen guys in it. I would tell Spider-Man-based fan fiction stories to myself while I played with them, and would over the course of weeks even have cliffhanger episodic stories that I would continue week after week after week. I loved having Spider-Man team up with Daredevil and Wolverine and Captain America in these stories. Occasionally, Hulk would show up, and I even used a Chewbacca character that I had to play Bigfoot. Now, the same Bigfoot that appeared in the Lee Majors $6 Million Man episodes when I was younger. I had him make guest appearances in some of these episodes because he was a poor, misunderstood character. He wasn't really bad. I seriously spent thousands of hours, even well after I shouldn't have been playing with little doll figures, rolling out these large, epic adventures. Then I discovered something that most writers discover, and perhaps even take for granted. It's the magic that happens when you take these stories, these tales that you craft, and you put them on paper. Lesson 2, the magic of the permanence of putting pen to paper. It was great to be able to tell stories with little Fisher-Price figures. It was fun when in Cub Scouts or at school I got to act out stories on stage or tell a joke that I'd made up or even a ghost story, especially around the campfire when camping with the Cub Scouts. But if you took a story, if you took an idea and you wrote it down on paper, there was a beauty to the permanence there. It stuck. You wrote it down and you could get up and walk away. You could leave, and then someone else could later pick it up and enjoy it. They could experience that thing you created at some later date. There was magic, and there was a little bit of immortality in that. So I began to put stories down on paper. It started with little stick figure cartoons, many of which my mom still has in a box somewhere. Then I fell in love with the written word and the cartoon dialogue bubbles. They just weren't enough. There wasn't enough space for all the words I wanted to put in there. I loved drawing and I loved art, but I got to a point where I recognized that my talent as an artist was not as strong and not as much of an internal driving force as my talent and desire for story and words. So I began to craft stories. I remember as early as grade 6 being given an assignment that was a single sentence, and the idea was the class got this one line and we were supposed to write either the rest of a paragraph for that sentence or even, if we were so inclined, a full page that continued from that one line. Well, I didn't stop at a page. Of course I didn't. I would write a 4-chapter epic adventure from that one line, and it's something I continue to do and love doing. I was never a particularly good student. I'm almost convinced that some of the teachers passed me out of the next grade not because I was smart enough to earn it, but maybe because they were worried about all the trees that I would kill in the name of their writing assignments. So, sometime between grade 7 and grade 8, I was reading Conan the Barbarian comic books. And there was at least one of the Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan the Barbarian movies out. Now, my buddy Tom and I had been playing Dungeons and Dragons too, and I'd been playing D&D with a few other friends. So I took my love for these things, and I first created a cartoon called The Story of Conan Bach. Now, Tom's Barbarian in Dungeons and Dragons was called Conan Bach. Conan after the character, and Bach from the band he loved, Blue Oyster Cult. Now, my half-barbarian, half-ranger character was named Thundar Hunt. Thundar was named after a cartoon barbarian who was on television at the time, and Hunt because, well, he was a hunter. He's half barbarian, half ranger, so he was a hunter as well as a barbarian. I had used some of the adventures Tom and I had gone on in our D&D adventures to inspire further stories about these good friends, Conan and Thundar. And I started off by first drawing a comic of them. The art was based and riffed a lot on the Savage Sword of Conan artwork. I had the big muscled barbarian looking like Schwarzenegger and the scantily clad, sometimes naked women characters and other fantasy world creatures and monsters in it. Conan's story was told through his friend Thundar's point of view. And after finishing the 30 or 40 pages of the comic story, I wanted to write it out in long form, in actual text, in actual words. And it was around the same time I had discovered what I like to describe as my first love. My mom's Underwood typewriter. Found it hidden underneath a dust cover in the back of my mom's closet. I fell in love with that thing. I spent the summer of my 13th year, the years between grade 7 and grade 8, writing the novelization for this comic adventure. Knowing I couldn't very well use copywritten characters, I revised the name of the characters, and the main character was suddenly now not Conan Bach, but it became Aaron Bach, Aaron. I spent much of the summer either in my bedroom or, when it got too hot in the middle of the summer, in the basement of our house pounding away on this Underwood typewriter. At the end of the summer, I had my masterpiece of perhaps 30,000 or so words. It was, and is, an immature, silly, and not all that well-written novella. But there is a story arc to it, a beginning, middle, and end, and the characters learn and grow in the story. But it was horribly written. And because I was discovering sexuality, the novel was riddled with fantasy sex scenes in my 13-year-old imagination. I mean, really horrible sex scenes. But it was mine, which leads to Lesson 3. Lesson 3. Fan fiction writing is a great way to cut your chops as a writer. Like I said, it was an embarrassing book that would become the very first trunk novel that I wrote. Something to write and get out and then hide because it's that terrible. But the experiencing of dedicating time to working on that, of sitting alone for endless hours, of doing research, and I used D&D monster manuals and player handbooks for research to make sure I got the monster details correct, worrying about plot twists, and even taking out library books on kung fu and judo and fencing so I could properly describe some of the fight scenes and sword fights. I wrote and wrote and wrote while my friends were out on their bikes, while they were playing baseball, while they were going for a swim. That fan fiction writing that I did helped me realize that if I wanted to be a writer, I needed to work really hard at it. I even had to sacrifice things. I became a little vitamin D deficient as a pasty white skinny kid hammering away on a typewriter inside rather than playing outside. And I learned that not everything you write is solid gold. But I learned a lot about story structure and dialogue and storytelling, and I learned a lot about discipline as a writer from that experience. That embarrassing novel is still and shall forever remain in the trunk. But I won't throw it out because it means too much to me. Now, I have an old friend, one of my earliest love interests, who I showed that story to a few years after that. She actually kept a copy, and because we're still friends now, she occasionally threatens to let a little bit of that story out in the world, especially some of those embarrassing sex scenes that I wrote. So far, she's been really good. She's been a good friend, and she's only been good about teasing me and not actually letting the story out there. But she said if the money is right, you never know. But I think that doing that writing, terrible as it might be, even being willing to have shared that writing, it taught me part of the rite of passage for an author, and it's an important part of my development as a writer. And I cherish that experience because I started to learn early on the importance of creating a goal and sticking with it, of persevering and working hard and giving things up to make that happen. Well, that's it for the lessons learned for this episode. I thought I'd get through the entire writer journey when I first started, but I think I'm going to cap it off at those first 3 lessons. All right, those first 2 lessons, and then, of course, a new one because, you know, that whole flashback thing that I did. But interesting. I thought, you're still learning lessons today, so good to start with the one that I recently learned as well. Now, if you like this, if you like the journey and the lessons I'm sharing with you, let me know, and I'll continue on with further lessons and further of that flashback story to my writer journey in future episodes, because I haven't even gotten past the age of 13. I mean, I haven't talked about when I was 15 and submitted my first story to a writing competition. Now, that didn't work out well for me, but I learned something. But that tale and other lessons will be for another day. We'll catch you next week in episode 21, which should be a return to feature interviews. I've got some awesome people I'm interviewing in the next couple of weeks. Lots of great chats and insights and reflections to share. Well, here's hoping you enjoyed today's lessons, today's reflections. Here's wishing you good reflections and great writing.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomtech.com.